Do you remember the Calgary Bronks? I wouldn't expect many yeses to that question, as I'm continuing with my Remember the Calgary Series. We're looking at Calgary sports teams from the past. This is episode number 14. We're going to talk about the Calgary Bronks, as we're going to go all the way back to the 1930s, mid-1930s, up until 1940, just before the Second World War. And you could say that this is the last team that was the foundation of eventually the current day Calgary Stampeders. And of course, if you're returning and watch my Remember the Calgary series, welcome back, and you know I always have to ask that question. However, if you're new, welcome. As I'd like to do on my YouTube channel, I mostly do talk Calgary sports and talk about all the teams that we have right now in the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders. But I did have some inspiration to do a Remember the Calgary series to look at sports teams from the past. And this is episode number 14, and I have a separate playlist of all the episodes I have made up to date. And we're about halfway through the series right now. And obviously the inspirations I have all in the link description below, when I took in the Calgary Hitman Corral series, and as well as the local clothing company See It Dead Clothing, which specializes in putting logos of teams in the past that I have talked about already and still plan to talk about if you see the introduction video, as well as that Bruce Wilson story with this jersey collection. So those are all the inspirations that have me to do this Remember the Calgary series, and been an interesting, fun project. And what I've found already is that obviously Wikipedia is kind of the go-to place to go find information. And you'll just Google online and try to find images, and I do try to credit as many sources as possible where I find my information, but with some episodes have been much easier because of teams that were either recently or more common. This one was kind of iffy to find some relics to share, but I have found enough information to make an episode on it. So that's enough about the introduction. So now, if you want to see the last episode I did in the Remember the Calgary series in episode 13, I talked about the Calgary Inferno, the women's hockey team that was fairly recent, that won the Clarkson Cup twice. I also did throw in the Oval Extreme. So I actually talked women's hockey in that episode. But in this episode, I'll get back onto outside, go on the field, talk about some early football, where the Canadian football evolved from rugby. And the Calgary Bronks is the football team that was the last football team that Calgary had before the present day Calgary Stampeders. So now I'll bring up my notes and bring up all the links that I have gathered my information on the Calgary Bronks. As it says, the Calgary Bronx were a professional Canadian football team, obviously based here in Calgary, Alberta, that competed in the Alberta Rugby Football Union, the ARFU, in 1935, and the Western Interprovincial Football Union, the WIFU, from 1936 to 1940. And then after that, the Second World War happened, and they were succeeded by the Calgary Stampeders. The Calgary Stampeders were established in 1945 and has been around for 75 years. Some notable players that played for the Bronx, and actually were a couple that actually played for the Bronx and the early Calgary Stampeders that they highlight, is Bob Cosgrove, Paul Rowe, who actually was on the 1948 team and is in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame, and he actually is in the BC Sports Hall of Fame, Bill Wisick, and then Coach Cam Cronin was the head coach from the team from 1935 to 1938. So that's just a little gist of the Calgary Bronx. And they did also play their own games, like some other teams, including the Calgary Stampeders from 1945 to 1960, before they moved to Western Stadium. I did talk about some soccer teams in the past as well, that they played their home games at Mewata Stadium, which is on the west end of downtown, which is now the site where the Mewata Armory is, as well as the Shaw Millennium Park, if you're not familiar with Calgary. But that's just the gist of the Calgary Bronx. So now when it comes to the list of seasons, they actually had some success. They won some league championships, but they weren't able to get to the Grey Cup. And this was the early days where there were rugby union teams that played that if you won the league, you get the right to go play into the Grey Cup. And there's definitely one team that was a thorn in the side for the Calgary Bronks that was in his early days, that Calgary Bronks never got to compete for the Grey Cup itself, but they were close enough that if they won the final game in the series, that they would have at least had a right to play for the Grey Cup. So for the first season in 1935 in the Alberta Rugby Union and the ARFU, they only played 2 games, and they were first in the league. They were 2-0, so it was a shorter season. They mentioned in the playoffs that they beat the Meralomas 14-0, and then they lost the Western title game against the Winnipeg 7-0, which is the early version of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers that are the team today, and that's definitely one team that's going to be a thorn in the side for the Calgary Bronks. Looking back at their history, as that's all base I can find, because obviously this long predates me as well as many people watching this video, and you have to go back to your great-grandparents to remember the Calgary Bronx. So in 1936, when they moved into the Western Football Rugby Union, in 1936, they had a rougher season as they finished third in the league. They were 1-5, but they did actually get to go in the playoffs, but they lost in the finals against the Regina Rough Riders. It was 3-1. That's another team that eventually evolved to be the Saskatchewan Rough Riders today. So there is some Canadian football, early formation in this league as well that eventually, are the present days today, teams today. So in 1937, the Calgary Bronx had a better season, as they did finish first in the league with a 5-3 record, but they lost to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the final 19-14. So once again, Calgary did not get past the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, kind of like what happened in 2019, unfortunately, but then the Winnipeg Blue Bombers ended their drought eventually after they beat Calgary and Saskatchewan. So yeah, even back then, Calgary struggled with Winnipeg in the playoffs, it seems like. In 1938, the Calgary Bronx had an even better season. They were first in the league, and they finished 6-2, but they lost in the league finals once again to the Blue Bombers. They lost in the 2-game series, so it was an accumulation of the scores. And then 1939, they were finished third in the league. They were 4-7. However, they won the semifinal as the league got bigger. They actually beat the Rough Riders, Saskatchewan Rough Riders, 24-17. But then into the league final, once again they lost to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in a 1-1 series, with the accumulation of the scores favoring the Blue Bombers. Back in those days, generally they played like a 2-game series, and it's accumulation of the aggregate score, whoever the better score in the 2-game series, that ultimately was declared the winner. And then the last season, before the team didn't stop play for the World War, and then in 1945 became the Calgary Stampeders. In 1940, they were 2-2. They finished second in the league, but once again they lost to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in a 2-0 series. So if we look at the league season in 1935, when it comes to the playoffs, if we go to the league champions, I'm trying to find the playoff bracket here. It was 7-0 to the Winnipeg Pegs. That Calgary had a bye into the semifinals, where they beat the Vancouver Meralomas. So that team was from Vancouver in the semifinals, 14-0. They eventually played the Winnipeg Pegs and lost 7-0. And hey, it was Winnipeg and Hamilton in the Grey Cup that season in 1935. And if you look back at my On the Road to the Grey Cup series, where I broke down the matchup, there was a lot of history between Winnipeg and Saskatchewan in the playoffs. So that was that. So then when it comes to the 1936 season, the Bronx were third in the Western Interprovincial Football Union. They also competed with the Interprovincial Rugby Union, with the teams like the Toronto Rough Riders, the Hamilton Tigers and the Montreal Indians. Then there was the Ontario Rugby Football Union, where you had the Sarnia Imperials, the Toronto Balmy Beach, and the Hamilton Tiger Club. So that's where some of these other teams that you see on the Grey Cup, if you go back in the early days on how they eventually won the Grey Cup. But then Calgary also had a better record in the Alberta Rugby Union with that 6-2 record. And then when it comes to the playoffs, I mean, there was the Regina Roughriders that we lost 8-1 that season in 1936. And then if you go to 1937, where if you look in the standings, that's where the Bronx finished first in the Western Interprovincial Football Union. But when it comes to the Grey Cup playoffs, eventually is the Grey Cup playoffs, where Calgary did beat the... See, this is where it was split. That where Calgary lost 19-14 in the playoffs. So that the first week, Calgary won 13-10 in Game 1, but in Game 2, it was the Winnipeg Blue Bombers that beat the Calgary Bronx 9-1, and then it was a 19-14 overall, where Winnipeg was able to advance to the Grey Cup in 1937. So it was back in the day where there were championship games over a 2-game series, which might be some debate on could they still do that today as well, especially, you know, bringing the variables if someone had a bad game that can redeem themselves. But I think it's fine it is with just a single game elimination. And then, you know, in 1938, the Bronx were tied with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers at 6-2 in the regular season, so they were the powerhouse teams that season. But yeah, you see 3 divisions, 3 different leagues that eventually came to play. And then, you know, when it comes to the playoffs, I mean, Calgary always kept seeming to lose to Winnipeg, as Calgary lost 7-2 and then 13-2 in the playoffs in the 2-game series. And then 1939, once again, when you're looking at the playoff bracket, that the Bronx beat the Regina Roughriders 24-17, but then lost to Winnipeg 28-7 to get to the finals. And that year was the Winnipeg Blue Bombers beat the Ottawa Roughriders 8-7 for the Grey Cup championship. And then in 1940, the last season, when it comes to the Calgary Bronx, we lost to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers 7-0 in the first game. Then the second game, we lost 23-2, so we had no chance of getting to the Grey Cup. And then the Grey Cup championship, that's where you had the Ottawa Roughriders beat the Toronto Balmy Beach Beachers. Original names back then, but that is the gist of the Calgary Bronx that I found. So then once again, I'll bring up the stamp story link that I mentioned in the Calgary Tigers episode, where I talked about the Calgary Tigers in episode 5, but that was mostly the hockey team. But there was the rugby team where, you know, you can trace back the Calgary Stampeders to the Calgary Tigers, because in the said at the beginning, in 1909, football Calgary dates back to 1909 with the emergence of the Calgary Tigers and the newly formed Alberta Rugby Union. And then it mentions the Tigers were dominant force in provincial football for 4 years, when they captured the Western Canadian Crown, which is the Hardy Cup, in 1911. So if you look at the Hardy Cup, you'd see the Calgary Tigers on that trophy. And then in 1915, the Tigers gave way to a new team in Calgary called the Calgary Canucks. They only played 1 season. I did mention that in the Tigers episode. They only played in 1919 because of the World War, and the official league was never formed. And then in 1923, after the First World War, football returned to Calgary. That the 50th Battalion was formed, named after the battalion that provided the organization support. And then in 1924, the 50th won the Alberta title, but was down by Winnipeg in the Western Final. Damn, Winnipeg. They like to beat all our football teams back then. Then in 1928, football in Calgary took a 4-year hiatus until the Tigers resurfaced, which I mentioned that in the that episode. Made history that year, being the first forward pass in Canadian football. So there's some history there. And then in 1931, the Calgary Atollas became a 4-year existence, playing at Mewata Stadium, which at the time had 2,000 fans. And then the Atollas gave away to the Calgary Bronks, which is the team in this episode. That became part of the Western Interprovincial Football Union. And then the Bronx, they took the league championship in 1938, but then in the Grey Cup playoffs with the other leagues, they weren't able to get into the Grey Cup final. And in 1940, senior football in Calgary ended when the World War II began. And then in 1945, it was the Stamps played their first game against Regina and the Rough Riders, and it was a 3-0 win. There was their own regular season 1945 after beating Regina 51 in a 2-game total series, but Calgary lost to Winnipeg in the Western Final in 1945, so that was kind of the foundation of the Calgary Bronks that eventually became the Calgary Stampeders. So that is the Stamp story there as well. So that's all I can find for when it comes to the Calgary Bronks. I did find a few interesting relics that, if you go back to the Daryl Slade on Twitter, which I did find some relics that I put in the video when I talked about John Huffnagel and Henry Burris being inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame for the 2020 class. But I did find a few other relics that I'll share. There was a Glenbow archive that I found that showed the team that won the championship, I believe, in 1938-39. And then there was a global story that shared about some players that actually played in those rugby leagues. And then, when the play was suspended for the Second World War, that many players, they went from one uniform to the other and went and played in combat. And then I mentioned at the beginning that there was a few players that, including Paul Rowe, who one of the early superstars that played for the Calgary Bronx, also played for the Calgary Stampeders and was on the 1948 team, where it was the first team that the Calgary Stampeders won their first of 8 Grey Cups back then, and in 1948 it was a perfect season for the Calgary Stampeders as well. But that's all I can find for the Calgary Bronx, as you can't really find too much, especially when you're looking back on teams back in the mid-1930s. And of course, I'm not going to go high and wide to find information in the library or try to find as many sources as possible. And actually, when I was mapping out episodes, and I did find some hockey teams just to fill in to try to cover many of the hockey teams on the hockey database. There is a few teams that I won't have as much information on in this series, and there's a couple instances I had to make some of a makeshift logo that I found. At least there was enough sources that I was able to find the logo and clip the logo to use for the thumbnail for this episode for the Calgary Bronx. But I had to say, if you read my links in the description below or find out about the Calgary Bronx football team or rugby team, I mean, what would have been interesting? What would have like to go watch a Calgary Bronx game back in the day at Mewata Stadium back in the 1930s? And it's just very interesting to see what Canadian football was like back then to what it evolved to what it is now, where ultimately the Grey Cup was awarded for the championship in rugby, and eventually rugby evolved into the Canadian football game today. I mean, that's how the dimensions of the field came in, and now it's just very interesting that you can look at the Calgary Stampeders today, and they've been around for over 75 years. It traces back, the Bronx, and going all the way back to the Altolas, and all the way back to the Calgary Tigers. So I'd say, what do you think of the Calgary Bronx, as we'll say? Well, that's what I'll have for the Remember the Calgary Series. So in the next episode, which is kind of interesting, I'm wearing some Calgary Stampeders gear, but in episode 15, I'm actually going to talk about the Calgary Stampeders, but not the football team, as there is a hockey team. And I'm going to think that episode, I'm going to need a lot more time to get relics and notes put together for the Calgary Stampeders hockey team, as there were various incarnations of the Calgary Stampeders hockey team, that played for the senior championship, won some Allen Cups. So I'm going to think it's going to be a little more time to come up with the next episode. I know the last few episodes I was able to find enough relics to put in and make a video and a whole episode on it, but I think the next episode will require a little more work, so it'll be a few weeks, I would think, before I can get ready to make that next episode. But as I always like to close out my videos, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fan's journey, home of the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, and formerly home to the Calgary Bronx, you know what you do, just make sure you hit like, subscribe, as I do mostly talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel. And this is one thing I'm talking about, Calgary sports from the past, has happened already. But I also do have personal blogs, attempt to comedy, and I also do share my experience with them on the road at a sporting event. So if that all sounds like it'd be interesting to watch, do follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey. You know what you need to do, just make sure you like, subscribe. I also have my other social media links down in the description below. For other ways you can follow me, you don't get any news on what I plan to do on my channel, as well as, for example, when I'm about to make the next episode in my Remember the Calgary series, for example, for episode number 15. So as I say, that's all I have for the Calgary Bronks rugby team. I mean, I have enough information to find how they did in each season, how the playoffs went, and a few players that played for the Calgary Bronks. I mean, it's trickier to find, more in-depth information on players and certain events and that, especially when you're going back to the 1930s. I have all the links in the description below that if you want, you can look a little more deeper, and maybe potentially if I find something else, there's always that possibility I might make a follow-up video separately outside of this playlist. But at least this playlist, I got all the teams from the past in there that's up on this platform. Anyway, so as I say, I'll see you in the next video, and hopefully you enjoy my Remember the Calgary series or any other content that I put on my channel. So